liberal Supreme Courts should misinterpret the Constitution to advance progressive rights. So I'm going to start with a clear model, and then go into my two main points that I'm bringing to you today. So our clear model is, basically, how are we interpreting misinterpret? Basically, we're saying that we're defining this as misinterpret is the law is written, but it is not intended to advocate for progressive rights. We're talking in the scope of LGBTQ and women as well, and then to a higher degree, other marginalized groups throughout this debate. Also, we're speaking in the terms of the United States for this motion, and also we're defining progressive rights as basically rights are not currently defined by the US Constitution. We also want to make known that we are not trying to rip out the Constitution, but we're trying to add to this so we can make sure that these marginalized groups experience the most and the greatest amount of human rights possible within our nation. Okay, so basically, how else are we interpreting this? We're also saying that by doing this, we're going to add to make sure these people feel as if they have a say within the government, and they also feel as if they're being heard by the government in its entirety. Okay, so let's go into our first 2 points. No, thank you. So our first point is basically, how is this going to help marginalized groups? We are saying this is going to help marginalized groups because this is ultimately going to give them the rights that are denied by the Constitution in its entirety. So we give this the example of the LGBT community. We are saying how many people right now feel as if they don't have a say and they feel as if the government is not ultimately on their side and they can't petition them as a whole. They feel as if they're in this closed bubble and they can't speak out or do anything because they do not feel supported in its entirety. We're talking about transgender people trying to join the US forces and ultimately being denied because they feel as if they have no say and nothing is being done to the point where they are being petitioned, but it's not being rightly addressed. And we want to make sure these progressive rights can be addressed without having to petition the government in its entirety. And this goes into our second point. Basically, why does it set precedent for local courts? We're saying this does this because we want to force them to follow suit for these progressive cases. We want them to make sure that they are ultimately passing this without having to go through the rigmarole that is already set in place throughout. And also, we are seeing so many cases at the local level for this, and very few go to Supreme Court for greater change. And these courts are swamped at the Supreme level. And we're saying if the local level can deal with this, then we have less jam when it comes to the Supreme Court, and ultimately we can make sure we get even more progressive rights to benefit the greatest amount of people, and especially these marginalized groups that feel as if they have no say and they feel oppressed by the US government in its entirety. We're also going to bring up the cases of just equal rights in general. I mean, things such as just the ultimate thing that the idea of, equal pay, and then these cases such as Roe versus Wade, when, the idea of having to petition the US government for just the basic rights of having an abortion, when in reality it had to go to that Supreme Court level to even see change. And that took how many years in the 1970s? And it's still questioned to this day. And these cases should not have to experience that, but should be able to be petitioned, go through court in an easier process instead of having to wait years for ultimate change. So that's what we're saying on our side. So ultimately, that's what we're bringing to you today. We're bringing to you these two main ideas. Basically, and our main point that we're trying to showcase is, or the problem in our society today is, basically these marginalized groups feel oppressed and they feel as if they have no say, and this is going to make sure these people can have a greater impact on society, and they feel as if the government is hearing them out and the government knows that they are there and that they can be helped, so they don't feel as if they're so boxed in and they can't. Yes?
If the conservative if the Supreme Court shifts conservative for, say, 20 years, surely that would undo all the progress you've just listed, right?
So we're trying to say that at the local level, that's why we want it to be petitioned within the local courts first. Because we want these local courts to ultimately be going through this so we don't have to jam when it comes to the Supreme Court. And these individuals don't feel as if they have to wait years for progressive motions to come into place. This leads into our next example. How many years did it take for the Separate but Equal Act to ultimately, Separate but Equal Supreme Court case to ultimately get overturned? It took decades, and we're saying that this is ridiculous. These people in these marginalized groups should not have to feel as if the government is ultimately taking their rights and ultimately oppressing them, but should feel as if they can trust the government and they can be properly represented and properly heard within the US government and within the US system in its entirety. So that's our response to that, ultimately. So what are we getting on our side? We are ultimately getting a more fair system and a place where marginalized groups can feel as if they have a say in the government and they know as if they can trust the government and they can trust the individuals around them, locally and at the Supreme Court level. I will take another question. PY, nothing. Yes.
So we think that actually what this does is it sets a precedent for conservative Supreme Courts to do whatever they want. And we think that these marginalized groups are probably going to feel way less trusting of the government when the policy is constantly flipping back between conservative and liberal.
So honestly, here's the thing. We're trying to make sure that at the local level, that's really what we're trying to set precedent at. Well, the Supreme Court does have a major impact and ultimately has the final say. We're saying that a lot of these laws can be precedented at the local level, and that we're saying that because of this, that's why we need this. So these people do not feel as if, oh, every few years there's going to be shifting, but they know they have some stability. On our side, we're guaranteeing them this stability. We're saying on your side, by having and continuing with the system in its entirety, we're going to see the shift to a higher degree in general. On our side, we're making sure these marginalized groups do receive the rights they know they deserve, and they can feel as if they are trusted throughout in its entirety, and that's why we are proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister and like now to invite the leader of OP here.
Alright, I'm going to start with rebutting efficiency on Gov side with my first point. My first point is how President will have long-reaching impacts. If Democratic Party judges blatantly misinterpret the Constitution, conservative judges are going to do the same. This means liberal progression can thus be ultimately reversed when the Supreme Court switches back. This is essentially going to result in inconsistent civil rights. A good example of this is bringing back the case of Roe v. Wade, which established the right to privacy regarding abortion. If our Constitution is viewed unnecessary to follow, this would lead to abortion pro-choice activism being dead in the water for a possible lifetime. Because people wouldn't have to follow the Supreme Court as it wouldn't be viewed as legitimate, which gets into, I'll talk about again in my third point. My second point is how the Supreme Court judges should not be the actors. First, they're not elected by the people, they're elected by the president, and thus they only represented a limited idea of what progressivism means because they're not directly representing the people. An example is the judges who pushed for the civil rights that also pushed for eugenics, which is when it was a case involving a woman who was mentally unstable and was pushed by the Supreme Court to be sterilized because they wanted to end the generations of mentally unstable people. My third point is how Supreme Court judges are often men, often white, and almost always rich, and how this will delegitimize the Supreme Court. This is because the Supreme Court's intention was to be unbiased interpretations of the Constitution. In modern times, there is a veneer that this is still the case, and now, because of this motion, we are making it completely partisan, and no one's going to respect the rulings of the Supreme Court because they're not legit anymore, because people wouldn't have to follow the rulings. An example would be how no one's going to respect the gay marriage ruling because it's going to result in protests from conservative groups, even more than Roe v. Wade. Yeah, and that's why you should vote for
Thank you very much, and let's have the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Alright, let's start with some rebuttal. So, first of all, we have to say, we just like to say that we, again, are not adding to the Constitution or anything, so that's just something really important. And again, we are interpreting the Constitution in a way that it wasn't necessarily intended to exist, right? When we put in this amendment, it means that this group is probably not the group that it was intended for, like the idea of Roe v. Wade, that was taken under the right to privacy. That wasn't necessarily what the right to privacy was trying to talk about when it was enacted. However, when it was enacted, this did fall under that jurisdiction, which means that this is in fact a legitimate interpretation, while it may be slightly mischaracterized, as it is not necessarily what the people who put this into there were intending to do. So there's that. First of all, that. So we have this idea that it's going to take a really long time it's going to be easy to get these things happening, right? But then conservative courts will be able to take it back and go in the other direction, right? But let's take a look at how long this takes to have this process happen, right? We first take this in misinterpretation, quote unquote, and we say, you know, we're going to make sure that gay people are not able to be fired because their rights to not be fired under the sake of their sexuality is protected by this amendment, right? Let's just use that as an example. So, under this, there is a normalization period where this happens. This precedent is set in lower courts and also in the people who are here, which means that this is recognized as a right of the people for a long time. And when is it really hard to do currently in our system that we can see with gun rights? Take away people's rights. It's a lot harder to take away people's rights than actually give them rights. So this misinterpretation will allow them to have this happen, and this flip-flop won't be as extreme as, first of all, it will involve the precedents to not actually succeed in lower courts that has already taken place, so that these individuals who are currently being underrepresented by their government will then have their rights have to have them challenged and taken to court, be ruled enough to get to the Supreme Court to have this be taken down later. This means that this flip-flop is not going to happen in the extremity that Opp wants to characterize. Also, this isn't every single Supreme Court decision. This is some decisions in which progressive rights are being threatened. These rights are things that are necessary to people to live and be alive and to thrive and to have an ability to live under life, happiness and the pursuit of happiness and all these different things that the Constitution is supposed to be there to protect these rights to have. So again, this will be solving the problem that we have of people's rights being infringed upon. For all of these reasons, it shows that not only will this help people who the court is directly involving in these specific decisions, but also it will set a precedent so that lower courts and other decisions will then make similar ones. This will then affect our society because we have these rights that are being established, which was our second point, that this precedence will have an effect on people in general. Once we have these rights of people, again, it becomes a lot harder to get rid of, and it makes people in general see these rights as something that people actually deserve, which then allows them to have this. And then when we have this normalization, it takes how long to get these to the Supreme Court. And not only are these not going to be able to be challenged as much later, but people will recognize these rights on the higher levels. People who aren't involved in the government, people who are just alive and living their lives because their rights are no longer being threatened, which means that we're allowed to see these people as people. Yes, Frank?
Was this normalization process involving the lower courts effective in the response to Roe v. Wade?
The main point with that is that Roe v. Wade has not yet been taken down. And while this may have been a misinterpretation, and there are certain laws that are currently questioned in certain states, this is something that is currently enacted and is currently protecting people's rights on a greater scheme throughout the nation. This is something that is currently happening and is helping people with in this system. For all of these reasons, we can see that people in general are helped, that our progressive system, or that our system, which is already becoming more progressive, as we can see, you know, we used to have slaves a long time ago, and now that's not okay, because we have laws against it, and because we interpret laws to be against certain things. And while we have specific ones addressing that, in these misinterpretations, we have things like Roe v. Wade and the right to privacy, which guarantee things like abortions and birth control, and make it a lot harder to have these things be discredited from people and seem like it's not their actual rights to have these. For all of these reasons, we get to see that people are helped under this motion. People are able to thrive better under this motion. And again, going back to our point about how there is trust within the courts, when people don't have their rights threatened, and when people are able to do this, we have a greater trust in government, because we see that people have our backs. And the idea that conservatives may lose some, well, there's a lot of liberals currently losing, are there a lot of liberals who don't see anything because of gun rights being protected? Not necessarily, because, or that will happen in some degree, but it will happen on either side of the house. And so with this, we have liberals and conservative individuals who will then have their rights be put in place and be a lot harder to take down down in the future, which means that these individuals are then going to have their rights protected and have them far more permanently under this system. This misinterpretation is something that is actually going to be helpful and be a moral system that these individuals are going to be able to enforce in the long run, as our government will be enforcing this and be normalizing this within our society. For all of these reasons, it means that people will be able to live better lives. They will not be as threatened, and they will have larger trust in their government. This means that we will have a better and working system that is there to protect people and that will allow people to live better lives, fulfilling the goals of the Constitution and of the American people. For all of these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank you very much. And to conclude the opening half, I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
So what this debate has been lacking so far is real understanding of how the judicial branch interacts with progressive politics and how it can interact with progressive politics in the future. And I will be providing that in both, my partner provided some of that in her speech, but I will also be providing it in my speech. However, before I go into 3 points of reconstructive and a point of new material, I would first like to deal with one central point from government case, which is that lower courts will help this process of normalization, which is nonsense if you look at the historical record on how these progressive policies and progressive Supreme Court rulings typically work. That's why I brought up in my POI the example of Roe v. Wade. Frankly speaking, the lower courts were garbage in terms of defending Roe v. Wade. In fact, they actively targeted it, ripped out all of its material. That's why in so many states there's only like one Planned Parenthood available, one abortion clinic. That's literally what the lower courts do. Just acting as though, well, the Supreme Court said so, so we have to agree with it is absurd. That's not how it happens when it comes to how these progressive Supreme Court rulings actually work. So my partner brought up 3 points. The first point is that precedent will have long-reaching impacts, and this is very important to emphasize. Government talks again and again of how well Supreme Court rulings are really hard to overturn. What I would point out, however, is that government is not as static as people think it is. I would point to, for instance, the recent in the legislative branch. The recent consequences of the nuclear option done by the Democratic Party. When they decided to change the vote for cloture to a simple majority, that had long-reaching impacts. And then when the Republican Party took over the White House and took over the legislative branch, what happened? They pushed through Kavanaugh, they pushed through Gorsuch, and now we have a Supreme Court majority because they also decided they could change the rules. If it's understood that both sides can misinterpret the Constitution, then both sides will misinterpret the Constitution and will react accordingly. Because frankly, the Supreme Court has never been viewed as a legislative branch. If we start viewing it as a legislative branch, they'll start treating it like a legislative branch. So, that is a reconstructive of my partner's first point. Moving on to the second point, which is that Supreme Court judges should not be the actors. Now, let's, for 1 second, assume that government's right. They can push through these progressive policies. I would like to question right now, whether or not a Supreme Court judge can be an effective progressive actor. And that, first of all, I would question whether or not progressives as a whole even think that they're very democratic to begin with. They're not elected by their people, they're elected by presidents, and they can be presidents who have lost the popular vote entirely, as we saw in the example of Donald Trump selecting 2 Supreme Court judges despite losing the popular vote by 2 million. And this extends out in the fact that often these progressive viewpoints are limited by perspective. We're talking about judges who have gone through law schools like Harvard, who have experienced the silver spoon all their lives. Are we really to believe that these are the progressive actors we should emphasize? They're clearly not going to be representative of the progressive base. Now moving on to reconstructing the third point that my partner brought up, which is that it would delegitimize the Supreme Court. Now, here's the thing. The Supreme Court, surprisingly throughout its history, has actually not been as partisan as one would anticipate, in that there's a level of respect afforded to Supreme Court judges historically that has not been afforded to, say, as a good example, actually, I think everyone can agree that very little people have